Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Welcome to Polycarp's Paradigm, everyone. I'm so glad you are here to check out the podcast. I have a very special guest with me today, my dear friend, Michaela Barta.
Hi, Eric.
Hey. We were just talking, our friend-iversary is coming up, almost 3 years. We are a little fuzzy on when exactly we met, but sometime 3 years ago was
This
when
summer.
we met. Yes.
Yes,
And
we've been through a lot.
we have, because the following summer, 2017 was our big Camino trip. Me, you, and Tanya hiking the Camino
Walking the Primitivo.
with our dear friend David. If David's listening from England, shout out.
We love you, David. My legs are still better than your legs.
Oh, wow.
David thinks that remember how he always used to say, like, my legs are better than all of you,
Yes.
you know?
Yes. Oh, my goodness. I miss that man. But anyway, it's such a privilege to have you on, Michaela, and I'm excited to start this series of Theology of the Body with you. It's something I've been curious about ever since becoming Catholic a few years ago. I heard the term Theology of the Body. I had no idea what that meant, but it sounded cool. Every time I mention it to people now, I still don't really know what it means very much, but I think it's cool, and so I'm excited. I'm actually taking a class this summer on Theology of the Body so I can know a lot more about it, but I wanted to get your expertise for the grand crowd out there who's listening,
Right.
And just kind of introduce Theology of the Body. But first, wanted to hear from you just a little bit about your story and how you got interested in Theology of the Body.
Okay, great. Yeah, well, first of all, I'm no expert on TOB, but I will say, I think, you know, as we continue talking, maybe some stories will come up. I think it has impacted me so profoundly as I've studied it and I've only taken 3 courses from the TOB Institute up in Pennsylvania, but just from studying those in the last 4 years, it has really profoundly impacted me and just changed the way that I live my life.
Wow.
And so there are, you know, some cool stories of like practical application, you know, we could say where the theology becomes lived experience. And so that has been the case for me, although I'm certainly no expert. Even as Eric was like talking about, like even as you were talking about like reading all the audiences, I'm like, oh gosh, like I gotta brush up because I like certainly haven't read them all like you know, word for word. I've read a lot of them. So anyway, but how did I get into it? I think honestly, I like barely even remember. I think like I'd heard about it randomly in high school. And then wasn't really taught it in high school though. And then at one point in college, early college, I remember my old, she's not old, but former young adult minister. Her name's Claire, and she's wonderful. We did this DVD series with Christopher West, and it's called like Freedom to Love. And so, okay. And there's like something I remember really profoundly from that, like learning about the difference between license and freedom, right? So freedom is not doing whatever you want, whenever you want. That's license. Like I have the license to do something, but it doesn't mean it's not going to make me a slave. And so that series, Freedom to Love, came from some of John Paul's writings. Mm-hmm. And that was when I first really started like being like, this is crazy. Like this is really cool. And this resonates at a very like, you know, almost like, I don't know, like molecular level. Like I'm just like eating this stuff up. And then I think I went to a couple events that Christopher West did when I was like maybe 20 or 21. And so, yeah. And then I just wanted to go to the Institute. I was just trying to find a chance to go. And I found a way to get enough money because the courses are $1,200 plus a plane ticket. Wow. And it's like a week-long course. And so the first time I went was June 2015. So that was 4 years ago.
Okay.
As we record this podcast in June. So, yeah. So only 4 years. It's not a long time at all. But a lot has happened. Yeah. Since then. So.
And I know, you say you're not an expert, but I mean, I don't know anyone who can really claim they're really an expert other than St. John Paul II himself.
Perhaps. Yeah.
And perhaps even he wouldn't even say he was an expert.
Sure.
I really appreciate having this interview with you because you do have that experience at the Institute. You have that lived experience, as you were saying. And you give talks all the time on theology of the body.
I do, yeah.
To young adults in Houston and beyond. And
teens.
Lest we forget about the younglings.
The youths.
The youths of the nation.
No, I bring them up because I actually have it right here. I have these reflections from them that I want to keep finishing from when I did a crash course for the juniors at Incarnate Word and just taught them TOB for 2 days. And reading their reflections is pretty cool to see what stood out to them.
Yeah.
So,
wow.
Yeah. Anyway, yeah, teens.
Okay, so I guess the first question for everyone is, what is theology of the body? Like, what do we mean by that?
What do we mean? Well, we know theology is the study of God.
Yes.
Right? And so the theology of the body, I think one of the first definitions that I ever heard and that stayed with me is that our bodies, we think of them because of science and progressions in science, right? And STEM, right? All of that. We think that the body is just biological, but the body is, we learn from TOB that our bodies are not just biological, they're theological. And so that there is something that we can learn about ourselves and even more so about who God is when we look at our bodies and when we reflect upon them, right? And we study them, that we can learn something about who God is. So there is a spiritual component in a very real way to the human body. So it's not just this combination of atoms, molecules, whatever, that there is a real theological component to the human person.
Yeah, and I think I remember seeing a quote from St. John Paul II from Theology of the Body that says, the body is the only means by which the invisible becomes visible.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite quotes. Yeah.
Oh my
goodness. The body and only the body is capable of making visible the invisible.
Yes, and so even in a marriage, that act, that sexual embrace, is that visible union that's signifying that invisible reality of the love between the spouses, which is the total gift of self.
Yeah.
Which I think that is my favorite definition right now of what love is. It's the total gift of self. Can you talk a little bit about that total gift of self and how it fits into this theology of the body?
Total gift of self. So that's diving in for sure a bit.
Are we going too far in the deep end?
Well, we could talk about. How about we could talk about gift first.
Yes.
I'm thinking when we talk about gift, right? So there's this idea that you find throughout the theology of the body that there is this constant war within the human person to either grasp or to receive.
Okay.
And to give, right? The mutual giving and receiving, or to grasp and to control, versus trusting, having the open hands of giving without any agenda, without any expectation in our giving, and then also the same in our receiving. And so what I found through TOB is this idea of the sacramental worldview, so that everything in the world that's created by God is good and is a gift. And everything can point to the divine. Everything is an icon. This is like something we learned, I learned at the Institute is, the cup of coffee, the glass of beer, the piece of chocolate cake, like whatever it is. I keep mentioning like food, items, food and drink, obviously, what my idols are. And those things are not bad, right? They're not, we shouldn't just look at them as occasions for temptation, or leading to gluttony. Like, those are real gifts, and they're tastes of heaven, they're hints of heaven. And so we really actually have to change our perspective of, okay, I have it in my hand right now, this cup of coffee that I love with my oat milk. It's so great.
Nice.
And am I going to, just receive this as a gift and experience it, or am I going to just binge on it and have 5 cups of coffee? Mm-hmm. And so something that we've learned through TOB is this sacramental worldview is not repressing all of our desires, not indulging and being an addict in our desires, but redirecting our desires and finding in the gifts of the world that we allow them to lead us to God, rather than just getting stuck at the gifts of the world, because then we turn them into idols rather than I can sip this cup of coffee and be like, Lord, thank you so much. Like, I really want to have 4 more cups because it's just so freaking good. But like, I'm not going to do that, and I'm going to allow this to maybe just help me a little bit and turn into even a sort of prayer. Which is the point. Is everything in the world is good. Everything is a gift. Yeah. And what does gift mean, right? It's freely given and should be freely received and not grasped at. Not grasped at, just received as it comes, So that mentality is very different.
And I know just from, I've only read so far the first 11 audiences and an introduction to Theology of the Body. And a big theme, source for Theology of the Body is really going back to Jesus' own teaching when he's asked about divorce in Matthew 19.
Yes.
And in fact, let me just read those verses. Fortunately, I have them handy, just so we can know. And then it's going back to the beginning. So Christ is appealing to the beginning. So when I hear you talk about words like grasp or receive, I think of Eve grasping at the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? So that's where you're kind of getting that idea from,
right?
Because that's a source from Theology of the Body.
Right.
So this is what Jesus says. Some Pharisees came to him to test him and ask him, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason?" And he answered them, "Have you not read that from the beginning the Creator created them male and female and said, 'For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and unite with his wife, and the two will be one flesh. So it is that they are no longer two but one flesh. Therefore what God has joined let man not separate.' They objected, 'Why then did Moses order to give her a certificate of divorce and send her away?' Jesus answered, 'Because of the hardness of your heart Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so.'" And then the important first step is, okay, what is the beginning that he's referring to? And he's talking about Genesis. He's talking about that original creation and that original state of
man.
Humanity. Mm-hmm. Exactly. And that's when God makes man and woman, male and female, makes humanity in his own image and likeness as male and female. There's 2 creation accounts, right? There's the Genesis 1 creation account, which is called the Elohist account because it's using the term Elohim for God. And then there's the Genesis 2, which is called the Yahwist account because it uses the term Yahweh for God, which a lot of people believe that Genesis 2 actually was written before Genesis 1. But it's talking about that original state of, first you have original solitude, and then going into original unity. I'm getting ahead of myself here. I am.
Well, what we could tell them
yes.
is that TOB is really broken into 3 sections.
Okay.
Right? So the audience is really, John Paul addresses original man, and then he moves into addressing historical man, which is our state right now, where we're at, post-fall, and also in after Jesus, right? And living in the grace of redemption. And then the third part of his audiences is eschatological man. So that's the end times, right? That's man in the glorified state, resurrection of the body, all of that, and what that means. So those are the 3 sections of Theology of the Body. That's one way to look at how they're broken down, just for people to kind of have an idea.
And just so y'all know, too, when we say audience, we mean basically a sermon or a homily given by the Pope on a weekly basis. I think it was on like Wednesdays, right? His Wednesday audiences. And it was from 1979 to 1985, so over a 6-year period. And there's about 129, but there's also a few audiences that weren't quite in there that are also captured in the book that I'm reading called Man and Woman, He Created Them, A Theology of the Body, which just has all those audiences in it. So, okay, cool. So give us some more of those themes. So we're talking about giving and rather than grasping. So what are some other themes that are kind of big picture when we talk theology of the body? Like, what are those themes?
Sure. So we were talking about gift, right? So, Eric was wanting to get into talking about total gift of self, which is really big deal. And that's great. And so we're talking about John Paul often uses the word gift. He also loves to use the word responsibility. He has a collection of writings called Love and Responsibility that he wrote when he was Cardinal Carol Wojtyła. And that's actually, we're looking at it right now. It's on my coffee table. And so the word responsibility is also something that can be found in his writings. This understanding of being entrusted with our responsibility in how we love, and also there is another big theme where we're talking about the spousal meaning of the body. So this is also huge, that the body is for another, and that the male and female bodies, particularly the male body, doesn't make as much sense separately, right? They don't make sense on their own, but together we see that they make a lot of sense, and they go together. And so the spousal meeting the body is a whole theme that we can dive into. That's one theme. Another theme, we're talking about, we can learn a lot about vocations through theology of the body and understanding celibacy, and why it is good and why it is a gift in COB. I think even just like learning, a main theme when I think about it is that we learn from theology of the body is that to be human means to be called to communion. That was one of the first things I wrote at TOB 1. That's what Christopher West taught us. And I remember writing it down in my book of to be human means to be called to communion. And so often we fall into sin when we're in isolation in some capacity, and we find healing, we find love, we find a path to holiness when we are in communion with others, in communion with God. And that's what we're made for. And so to be human is to be made for communion, not to be alone.
Yeah.
And so the beginning, yes, Christ appeals to the beginning. And that's something that John Paul gets into first, of talking about original innocence, original solitude, and then original unity and original nakedness.
Yes. So it's so interesting because when he creates mankind, he creates them male and female. It says that in Genesis 1, that they're made in his image. And in Genesis 2, we see that first he creates man, but it really is a representative of mankind, humanity, and that humanity isn't complete until there is that woman who's there. And so then we have male and female, and that's when that image is brought to light, because now they have a communion of persons, which reflects the Trinity, who is a communion of persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So to be made in the image and likeness of God is to reflect the Trinity in their communion of love.
Right. There's a quote from John Paul that says, man does not so much like reflect the Trinity so much in a moment of solitude, but is in a moment of communion.
Wow.
Right. So, and that should be an encouragement to us that we are not made ultimately for solitude. We are made for communion. Yeah. And that should, give us kind of be able to take a deep breath and a sigh, that in our hearts we know that we don't want to be alone. Yeah. And that's not what we're destined for. Yeah. Yeah.
I know that was just a brief, I know I can't wait to get into the details with you. I'm hoping that we can do several episodes together, Michaela, where we can go over the audiences themselves. But this is more of a big picture introduction to theology of the body, this episode. And so let's hit on real quick, if there's other themes you want to hit on, we can do that. But I also want to get into why is this so relevant and needed in our culture? Why should people listen to this? Why should they listen to Theology of the Body? Why should they pick up that book, read those audiences, and get into this?
Yeah. Why does it matter? So, we know in the church, and we believe that God raises up saints in each age and each era to fight, to be able to be signs of distinction, to be signs of contradiction for the culture and whatever kind of the heresies are or the great battles. And so we know that we've seen that through different saints throughout the history of the church. And we know that right now the great heresies are really around the human person, that we actually at this point in 2019, we don't even know what gender is anymore. It's escalated right from abortion being so rampant and not having an understanding that there really is a human person, and we're going to acknowledge that there is no that we can't just do whatever we want with our bodies, that there is a natural progression, and we can't just try to make women male, by giving them birth control so that they can have sex without getting pregnant, that women are different than men. And so all of that, all of the different affronts on the human person and human life really are addressed and confronted through theology of the body of I feel like one of the deepest, revelations really through it. And of course we know, I'll give this caveat, is that the theology of the body is a study of the scriptures. And so theology of the body is not like a new teaching. It's not like that John Paul is revealing something that we did not find in Jesus. All of this, Jesus Christ is the full and complete revelation of God. Mm-hmm. And so John Paul is simply shedding light on certain scriptures that have been a little bit dimmed to us. Mm-hmm. And so it's important for people to be aware of that too. And
it's not just inventing new things.
Right, this isn't new. This is not a new teaching.
Yeah.
It's a teaching that's been
ancient.
It's ancient and it's been forgotten, and it's for a time such as this. It's for a time such as this, because the culture of death, human history, we haven't been in this place really where culture is in the place of saying that there's 50 plus types of genders, right? Mm-hmm. The culture is saying God did not create them male and female. God created them to decide whatever they want to be is who they are, right? And so it's a rejection of our own experience as humans, and that there are certain limitations to our humanity in the sense that we can't create our own reality. We have to embrace reality as it is, and we can't create our own. And so we must, our disposition must change towards acceptance of reality the way that it is. And I feel like that's a huge thing in the culture is, well, I don't want it to be this way, so I'm going to just change it. I want to be able to have sex whenever I want, if I'm a woman, and so I'm just going to take this pill. And okay, well, I want to just be able to indulge in pleasure as much as I want, and so I'm going to do this abortion thing because it's just a clump of cells, and I'm going to deny my own conscience. And of course, we know that women have also been lied to. Women have been lied to, and there are plenty of women who have been deceived and really did just think it was a clump of cells, that the baby. And so I think TOB is for a time such as this because we don't understand the meaning of the human body. And we are desecrating the most sacred thing on earth, and thing meaning persons.
We're desecrating the very image of God.
Exactly. Exactly. The most sacred creation is humanity.
And I mean, as you're talking, even going back to the whole idea of license and freedom, I remember I don't know if Jim Caviezel made it up, but I heard it first from him when he was giving a talk that I saw on YouTube one time. And he said, true freedom isn't the freedom to do whatever you want. It's the freedom to do what you ought.
Yeah, and he got that from Benedict.
I got that from Benedict.
From Benedict
16th.
16th, yeah.
Nice.
Yep.
Oh, yes, that's where he got it from. And that's such a beautiful quote. And then I'm also thinking of St. John Paul II in Veritatis Splendor, that great encyclical called The Splendor of Truth. And
really thrown off.
He talks about how in the Garden of Eden, you have those two trees that are highlighted. You have the tree of life. And God even says you can eat of any of these trees. So man has immense freedom. Humankind has immense freedom, right? But he says, don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which he points to that and says, you need to halt before that tree. You can't make up the laws, like the natural law. That's the realm of God, to create the law, the reality. And so
that is not in the realm of man.
Exactly. And when we try to do that, we become slaves of pleasure or slaves of our passions or slaves of sin. And like I was talking, I guess the reason why I've been passionate about this ever since I really heard about it, like as far as wanting to know more and more. So I'm just so excited about this. But I was recently on a trip, and there was a girl on the trip who's a teenager, and it gave me a good glimpse into this next generation coming up, basically, and just how much there is that lack of understanding of what the purpose of sex even is. Yeah. So I asked a group of these teenagers, actually, like, so what do y'all think sex is for? Because they were talking about having sex with their boyfriend or girlfriend, even just their friends, just for fun. And I was so that's why I was like, well, what do y'all think it's for? And they were like, oh, it's just for pleasure. I was like, do you think maybe it's actually for making babies as well? Like, is that even a thing? Like procreation? And it's as if they hadn't even thought of that. That was the scary thing. I even talked to one of the teenagers, and he said, or I asked him, well, hey, do you know anyone in your sphere of influence or anyone that you know that believes that sex should maybe just be for marriage? He's like, no. I was like, wow. And I think it does come back to, well, what is the human person? How can we actually, because I think the yearning in their heart is to be free and to have joy and happiness and all those things. Those are good things, but they're finding it in the wrong place because they're not conforming their lives to God's design,
right,
which is ordered to our joy.
Exactly.
But,
exactly.
Yeah.
And I think, it's so funny that we are talking about this because I was literally just praying about this morning, and my own tendency, it was just coming up. I was praying about like that I am so terrified of having to do certain things or like be in a job where I don't always get to do what I want to do, and I'm terrified of being trapped in that way and whatever. And it was really getting to a point where like I'm just very nervous about being under authority, right, in a certain way, and having things that I really have to obey. And that was really like what was coming up, and I was like, crap, this is like the real deal stuff. And it really goes back to the garden. It goes back to recognizing that we are not the ultimate deciders of truth and natural law. That the Lord God set those into motion, and the Lord is truth. And so we have certain things that we must we have a choice to adhere to or not, right? And humility, right? The disposition is either pride or humility. And so it comes down to.
And I think what's cool is that when I was talking to some of them and was able to actually share with them the beauty of the church's teaching on sexuality, they were pretty amazed. And I've heard you say it before, like, we need to lead with beauty. Yeah. And that's something that Theology of the Body really does, right? Like, it shows, like, hey, actually that distinction between man and female is beautiful. And so one thing I heard, St. John the 23rd said is that man and woman are equal in dignity but complementary in roles. Yep. And so in our society, the lie is that equality is sameness. But that's not equality. Equality is equal in dignity. Sameness leads to a blunt, just a really dull form of life. Yeah. We need to have that diversity and unity, which reflects the Trinity. Right. But we need to have that distinction and that diversity and like complementarity.
The spousal unity and distinction.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what it's called. And right, and I think there's so much to be said about this that we could get into, talking about feminism and the long history of women being mistreated. Yeah. The long history forever, right? I mean, just indefinitely of women being abused, mistreated by men, taken advantage of, even particularly because biologically we don't have the capacity to be as strong physically as the masculine. And so if you look back right in Genesis where it talks about your desire shall be for your husband and he shall dominate you, like that's one of the curses, right, that comes from the fall. And so that we see now with feminism is this this upheaval, right? And this like this rise of women really kind of just avenging. They're being avengers in a certain sense, but it's in a horrible way that's just gone way too far, of like demanding justice to be treated with respect, but now just like trying to just almost squash masculinity
and their own femininity,
right? Because they've been so just, and maybe not even the women themselves, but maybe perhaps they're just angry for all of the women that have gone before them, and so they want to avenge, right? And so then they, because of toxic masculinity, they end up destroying their own sense of femininity in the process, or damaging at least. And then we have neither. We have a radical toxic femininity, and then a lot of men who are emasculated or other things. How do we get on this?
So what is it? Well, let's keep going. So what does it look like then for authentic feminism, like a real authentic femininity to burst on the scene?
This is a whole thing.
Oh, okay.
This is a whole thing. No, but we can
maybe a new episode. Well, just give us a glimpse into this. Like, give us a teaser.
I mean, Eric, I think I'm learning in myself toxic attitudes that I have, and so what I can share is seeing my control, is seeing my grasping, and seeing just different ways that I do not act in trust, and observing the way that the beauty of surrender, of actually giving God permission to act in me, right? Looking, and maybe for some people it sounds cliche. It's not cliche, but we, need to always like get a second glimpse at Our Lady, and looking at her as a model. But she is the most powerful woman who has ever existed. She's
the saint of all saints.
Yeah, she's the most powerful woman, and it didn't come through her trying to conquer. She did not try to conquer anything. She just said, let. And so let it be done. And so the word let has been something very much in my prayer. Let go, let it be done, just the word let has been something that has been resonating in my prayer for the last year.
Because that goes into the whole receiving.
Right.
Let it be done to me according to your word.
Yeah.
So receptive to the divine call.
Yeah, so like the scripture, I didn't know this until like 6 months ago, but apparently in Hebrew, probably the most powerful scripture in my life up to this point is two different ones, and one of them is be still and know that I'm God. Psalm 46:11, and the Lord has always spoken that to me for like the last decade, and I didn't know.
Come on, Michaela, get it.
Right, and I'm like still not getting it, and still like running around like a chicken with my head cut off and like forgetting how to be still. And the Hebrew for be still means to let go. Whoa. I did not know that until like 6 months ago. And I was like, wow, you've been telling me this scripture for like 10 years and you couldn't clue me in like earlier that be still means to let go. And so, which is funny, I think femininity, there has to come a point where we get to this, we find also in Theology of the Body that there is a certain wound, a very deep wound with men that has to get at inadequacy. And there's a deep wound with women about worth, right? Our value, our worth. Are we worthy? Are we worthy of love? Are we worthy of being fought for and pursued? And so the more that a woman steps into her worth, the more that she can allow men to be who they are, which is to be protectors and providers. In a certain sense, it doesn't mean that the woman can't be protective. It doesn't mean that she doesn't provide. Of course she provides, but it's different. It is different than the way that men do. Yeah. And I remember trying to explain this to the IWA girls, and they were like, talking about like, they were just so mad, talking about like the arguments that people make. Well, if a woman is dressed in a certain way, she's just asking to be assaulted. She's just asking for harassment, sexual assault, whatever. And of course we were talking about that of like, of course not. No, like just because she's dressed a certain way, the man is responsible for himself. He's responsible for his actions, his words, just as she is responsible for herself. And so we got into that of talking about, of course, that's never permissible. It's never acceptable. But we talked about the intentions of the woman. We talked about the necessity of a woman to be aware and making sure that she doesn't have an intention to seduce or to draw attention to herself in the wrong way, and talking about those things. And that was an interesting conversation too. But really what I wanted to get to with that was one of the girls I was talking about was like, men have a particular role to be protector and provider. And she was like, well, women are supposed to be protectors and providers too. Like, I disagree with that. And I randomly, asked her, I said, do you know the percentage of like men versus women in prisons? And she's like, I don't know. And I was like, I don't know either. And I was like, but I'm pretty sure it's something like upwards of 80% of the people in prisons are men. And we were talking about violence. And so I was making the case and talking to her about like men have a very different capacity for violence than women historically, right? Mm-hmm. Historically, we're talking about just in general, men have this different type of capacity to either build up or to destroy, right? And for violence. And so that's the one extreme. And then the other extreme is to be protectors, right? So a man stepping into his ultimate role is to protect and to and the opposite of that of violence. And I was like, and women, we don't, our greatest role as women is a little bit different than being a protector. We are like to nurture. We are to give life, to be receptive and life bearers in a way that's a little bit different. It doesn't mean that we can't be these badass, protector, strong mama bear. It doesn't mean that we don't be that.
Yeah.
But it means our ultimate calling is slightly different than men, and it's still hard for them to wrap their heads around.
I think what's hard too is we live in a culture of death, right? Where giving life, like a woman giving birth, isn't even seen as a good thing almost anymore,
right?
And where that used to be seen as like that's the greatest gift you can possibly give, because you're ushering in a new immortal soul, a new person,
right? And knowing that children are seen as a burden, like I want to work, and I find we praise productivity. And it's again, it goes back to, this also goes back to philosophy and John Paul II and other Catholic philosophers and just other great philosophers who understand that the human person, the difference between a human being and a human doing, right? We have adopted the belief that we are really just persons who do, and we produce, and we work. And we are not just made for work.
Right.
The understanding of work and leisure and being a human being is different. And really, we're going to be ultimately called to that, and that's going to be our experience in heaven, is being a human being, not doing all of these different tasks and work. It'll be a bit different. And so I think because of that shift in valuing productivity rather than leisure and being, we have lost that value of motherhood and of nurturing life, and it's just not as productive. It's preventing me from work.
And it's interesting because I think it was the Second Vatican Council that talked about that the human person is the one creation of God that is an end in itself. Like, the other creatures serve man's purposes, right? But we aren't to use each other. We are a gift to each other. Yeah. So we are an end to ourselves. Like, and I mean, we feel it all the time. Let's say like with multi-level marketing or something, where someone approaches you and you think like, oh, this is my friend. They just want to get to dinner with me. And then all of a sudden they're like, hey, by the way, like, I want you to buy this thing. They're using you for that other end. Yeah. And it's like, wait, I just wanted to be with you. I just want to have a friendship and a relationship, And that's a really simple example, but
perfect.
It's like, here's something I'm also thinking about lately. This is just off the cuff here, which this whole thing is, but but just like, I lost my train of thought there. I don't know. It's like, we are an end to ourselves. We're not a means to an end. Right. And that whole theme of being a gift to one another is just so...
Love versus use.
Love versus use, exactly. Oh, this is my thought. The things that we're talking about is, even big picture, like the gospel. The God became man that man might share in the very life of God. this theology of the body, the dignity of the male and the female, the equal dignity, complementary roles, the mission that they get to have together to be one with God. I think everyone out there listening, you want that to be true. Like, it's not just that it is true, because it is true, but it's that you deep down, you want that to be true. That's the thought that I was thinking. But we do live in a state where we're burdened by that original sin still, fortunately, that can be washed away through baptism. But we live in a world that's quote-unquote fallen and waiting for that eschatological breakthrough for Christ to come back and the redemption of our bodies ultimately. But so yeah, we get clouded and darkened by sin, and we live in a culture of death. But deep down in the human heart, even before the fall, there was that original innocence that we can appeal to and go back to and say, listen, this is what you were made for. This is the human person. And so that's why this is so powerful, because it's going into the very depths of the human heart. Right?
Oh, okay, so there's something that comes to mind when you're talking about this. There's something so powerful, right, that gets into the depths of the human heart. And maybe, I don't know if we want to wrap this up. I don't know what our time is at, but how are we doing?
We're doing good.
Okay.
Maybe another 5-10 minutes.
Okay. So one of my favorites so far that I've read, one of my favorite TOB quotes, right, from the audiences is, I think it's TOB 46 or 46:6, something like that. And or maybe it's TOB 43. And it says that the heritage of our hearts is deeper than the sinfulness inherited. And Christ came to reactivate that heritage and give it real power in human life and the human person. And Christ's words, and what he's referring to, what John Paul is referring to, is actually the scripture where Jesus says, formerly the law was that you shall not commit adultery, but I say to you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has committed adultery in his own heart. And what I've learned through studying TOB is that Jesus's words, sometimes we can misinterpret scripture as his words. And it's always been so powerful for me, are not so much a condemnation, but a calling. And this is where we talk about, we're in, historical man, right? In Matthew, when we move into the Gospels from Genesis, but Christ appealing to the human heart. Christ appealing to the human heart. And so Jesus is saying, your actions can be one thing, but it's your heart that I want. Your heart needs to be transformed. It's the fact that it's not even that you commit adultery, it's that you desire to do that. You desire to commit adultery, you desire to lust, or you desire to use a person as an object. I want to transform the desire. If you would only let me transform the desire. If you would give your desires that cause you shame, if you would just bring them to me, and I will help transform the desires, the ones that you don't want to show me, I'll help you. I will transform them if you'll only bring me the wound, if you'll only bring me the sin. And that way, you can see that the heritage of your heart, your own heart, is deeper than the original sin that you inherited from your first parents. That there is an original goodness that precedes the original sin.
Whoa.
The original goodness that precedes the original sin, and that you have the power to claim that and to own that and to step into that. That because you are made good, you have every capacity to choose good. Mm-hmm. Just because there's concupiscence does not mean you have to be dominated by it. And I have found this to be so powerful to remind teens and young adults that, yes, we have confession, and yes, we have the power of the sacraments, but beware of using it like a car wash, and beware of being, a slave in certain addictions, and then just always kind of using the sacrament in the wrong way of believing that you're just going to be dominated by it, because you don't need to be dominated by concupiscence, because you have the power of Jesus. And John Paul even says that man, there's this other really great part, I don't know where it is in TOB, but he says that man, the issue, if man is still a slave, right to his desires, and is not kind of like, walking more and more in gradual victory. That's what John Paul calls it, gradual victory. If man is still a slave, it's not because of something wrong with Jesus and Jesus's act on the cross and the graces that are available. It's man's will it's man's will, and his refusal to avail himself to the grace of God and to cooperate with the grace of God. And so I think I've just found that to be so liberating, to recognize, yes, original sin is real. Yes, concupiscence is real, but I don't have to be dominated by it.
Right.
Now, what are the things that are dominating me? Yeah, for sure. I've got issues with food and hedonism. I do. And I am I living for like the next meal or my next, movie I'm going to watch, or like even friend hangout, things like that. Like, am I living for these just pleasures? Or am I orienting my heart of like saying like, Lord, I want to step further and further away from hedonism and living just for pleasure, right? Like those teens were talking about. Because it's temporary, right? It's fleeting, and we can jump from thing to thing to thing, but ultimately, if we don't find our satisfaction in the Lord, that will not lead us to eternity.
Yeah, and the sacraments are grace, right? Those are graces given to us, and so we can cooperate with those graces. And the Spirit of the living God, the Spirit that raised Christ from the dead, after you've been baptized, you receive that Spirit in you. Yeah. And so, yes, you have God gives His whole self to us in the Eucharist. He gives His whole self to us in baptism. He gives us His whole self all the time. Yes. And so that woos us, that transforms our will. So we're being transfigured into the image and likeness of God by being conformed to the image and likeness of His Son, Jesus. Right. And I was praying this one time before Mass. I was like, Lord, please give me more joy, or please give me more wisdom, or please give me more peace. And it just dawned on me like, wait, you are those things in its entirety in yourself. Like, you are joy Himself, you are love Himself, you are goodness Himself. When you give me yourself in the Eucharist, you're giving me all of you, which encompasses all of that. And so how can we not be like transformed? So once we like have the light of faith and like let that just revelation transform us, let it. Yes, let it.
Yeah, to allow it. Give God permission.
Yeah. And this has been such a great conversation, Michaela. I did want to read one more thing. This is just from the introduction to TOB. This is going to be just kind of a teaser almost for maybe following episodes. Okay. But because we've talked about pleasure, and I want to make it clear that like pleasure is a good thing. Mm-hmm. In fact, there's a great lady, Dr. Alice von Hildebrand, who says that we need to baptize pleasure. Yes. Which I love that quote. Yes. I'm excited to learn more about what that means. But, pleasure is an accompanying good. It's not the actual end. It's not the actual goal itself.
It's an accompanying good.
It's an accompanying good. So it like helps even signify something we ought to do as creatures. Like it's pleasurable to eat, because guess what? We need to eat food to survive. Right. But if you only do it for pleasure, that's a bad thing.
So you're reducing it.
You're reducing it, exactly. So that's a part of it, but that's not the point of it. The point is like the actual nourishment that you get so you can live. Right. And the pleasure is like a great byproduct, a great accompanying good, really.
Accompanying good.
But this is something from the introduction to TOB that I think is just awesome, that'll blow your minds. It is clear that John Paul II sees much need for change in this area. He sees an insufficient appreciation of the goodness of sexuality among Christians. In his view, Christians suffer from this defect not because they are Christians, but because they are affected by the Cartesian vision of nature characteristic of the modern age and the consequent banalization of sex characteristic of the sexual revolution. One might well summarize John Paul II's judgment about the sexual revolution in this way. The sexual revolution does not sufficiently appreciate the value and beauty of sex. It deprives sex of its depth by detaching it from the spousal meaning of the body. It favors the sexual lie, in which the language of radical gift is overlaid by the contrary language of individual autonomy and the use of persons for pleasure. John Paul II clearly and frequently affirms the goodness of sexual pleasure, but he sees sexual pleasure as belonging by its deepest and innermost nature to the dynamism of radical gift between man and woman.
Hopefully they caught all that.
I mean, that kind of touches on like all the themes that we were talking about there, and this is why it's so relevant to today, right?
It is. And just to summarize that, one more time, is he's saying there's an insufficient appreciation of the goodness of sexuality. So we could say that Christians are still seeing a narrow view, a reductionistic, Christian or non-Christian. We're seeing a view of sex that does not sufficiently appreciate the beauty of it, and because sex has been detached, right? And so all of the purposes and the full, complete, 3D understanding of the view of sex has really been almost reduced to almost, we could say, like maybe a 1D experience of it, rather than the round, full. And then what happens is when we reduce it, what really struck me was that by the contrary language of individual autonomy, right, versus the language of radical gift. And Eric, as you were saying, what was coming to mind was our obsession with independence as Americans, our obsession with being independent. And we know that we're not
do whatever
called,
I want.
Right, and we know that ultimately independence in one definition is good, but in another definition, we are not made to be islands. We're made for others. Yeah. And that is the great distinction between, an American virtue, if you will, of independence, whereas we know we're called to interdependence, on each other, and then dependence on God. We are made to be dependent on God, which is something that we vehemently want to reject. We're made to be dependent on God, not for independence. And so that was just something that was also just coming to mind as you were reading. Individual autonomy is and that is so true in my own life. In so many ways, I found as I have closer friendships with people that I have a certain responsibility to them to check in on them, and for them to allow them to check in on me, and for me to not push them away, or not to let them in on my life is to push them away. And that as our friendship continues to grow, there is this holy and good expectation of sharing life with each other. And that when I push them away, especially my closest friends, it's not a good thing, Right. And I think I so long have lived in a certain sense of very unhealthy independence, and just my own experiences and life experiences of just feeling really alone in certain parts of my life growing up. So I think I have to shed that. I have to shed that desire to be autonomous and to be not, dependent on other people, and have other people, are sharing our lives together. Is, there's a quote that a friend told me once, and she said that we're carried into heaven, but we march into hell alone.
Wow.
Right? Autonomous, right?
Wow.
Independent. We march into hell alone, but we're carried into heaven. And so I think sexual revolution too is this I will just fight for myself, I will find pleasure, and I will make myself happy on my own. I don't need other people. I'm not called to radical communion, radical gift of self with others. I will just make myself happy, and I really don't need other people, and I don't want to need them, which
ironically does not lead to happiness.
No,
that's the sad thing.
Right. And it leads to hell on earth, what I mean. It leads to an experience of hell. And hell is isolation.
It goes back to, I think if your reaction if you're listening out there to this is I want my independence. Think deeper
why
about.
Do you want that?
Yeah, I think penetrate your heart a little bit more. I think you actually want what we're talking about. I think you actually want the radical gift of self and the communion of persons. You don't want to be lonely.
Right, but there's so much fear of vulnerability.
Yeah.
There's so much fear of but you don't understand. I've been rejected. I've opened myself up, and I've been abandoned. I've been rejected. And there could be anger and fear and rage that comes up of but you don't understand because I don't want to let someone walk away from me again, or I don't want to let someone do this to me.
But what you need to do is let God heal those wounds.
Right, and that's a whole... And so we would say to people who have maybe made it this far, are still in with us, is if anyone who's listening and is sensing that, I totally 100% relate to you. And I have gone through so much of my own anger of but Lord, I just don't want to allow someone to hurt me the way that I've been hurt in the past. I will not let someone do this to me. And it's been this slow unfolding of recognizing that love is that there are people in my life that God has given me as a gift, and I have to trust that those people, they have free choice too, and they have free will too, but to love is to be vulnerable. And so if I want to choose pleasure and just making myself happy, I can, but that is not what I'm called to. And that ultimately, no matter what happens, God will never abandon me. And I have to arrive at this truth of that he's never left me, and working through all of that. So this is this whole process of acknowledging your anger and acknowledging all of those things before you can, I think, and I still struggle with this to this day.
Me too. Like we're all on the journey, right?
Yeah.
But I'm reminded of, it is for freedom that Christ set us free. And one of my favorite verses, also one of my favorite lines of Jesus, is that he came to give us life and life to the full. And I think that's something that's at the heart of this. It's like, listen, when St. John Paul's explicating these scriptures, when we're talking about theology of the body, we're really saying, guys, don't we all just want life to the full? Well, it's revealed in Christ. And he wants to share his life with us so that we can have full, free life. Not license, but freedom, and living in that truth. And so I just think it's so cool that even God's designed us as material beings, that we can know the invisible through the visible, that we can know things about him through our bodies. So I'm so excited to dig more into this with you, Michaela, and
this is great.
To kind of go on the journey of theology of the body, because as I'm learning, that's kind of why I wanted to do this, so that we could all learn, and
together.
The listeners together, we're all learning this together. And so thank you for being our guide to this conversation.
We're all students. You know? Sometimes we all step into teacher position in our different gifts, but we're all students, and I'm processing a lot just from this conversation.
Yeah.
So.
Well, thanks be to God. Hope everyone out there has a great day. Thank you, Michaela.
Thanks, Eric.
Appreciate it.
Can't wait.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.